What you're about to hear destroyed a billionaire's empire in a single night. Sarah Martinez thought receiving a gold embossed invitation was the worst thing that could happen to her pregnant, abandoned heart. She was wrong. Dead wrong. The invitation wasn't just to any party. It was to watch her husband of 8 years celebrate his new love while she carried his miracle baby. But when Sarah collapsed in a pool of blood at that glittering mansion, bleeding onto marble floors as 200 guests watched in horror, she had no idea this was just the beginning, because the beautiful Mistress hiding behind designer gowns and perfect smiles, she wasn't who anyone thought she was. And the conspiracy Sarah was about to uncover would make her public humiliation look like child's play. This is the story of how one woman's darkest night became her greatest victory. But first, she had to survive what was coming next. The security footage would later become viral evidence. But that morning, Sarah Martinez had no idea her world was about to shatter on live stream. She sat in her Los Angeles kitchen, 7 months pregnant and glowing despite the exhaustion, when the doorbell rang with an ominous formality. The delivery man handed her a thick, cream-colored envelope with gold embossing. Her maiden name was written in elegant calligraphy, Mrs. Sarah Martinez, not Mrs. David Carter, the name she'd proudly carried for 8 years. The distinction felt deliberate, cruel. Inside, nestled in tissue paper like a venomous snake, lay an invitation that would destroy everything she thought she knew about her life. You are cordially invited to celebrate the union of David Carter and Madison Wells. Join us for an evening of new beginnings at the Carter Estate. Saturday, October 14th, 7 p.m. Black tie requested. Sarah read it 3 times before the words penetrated. Her husband of 8 years, the father of the baby growing inside her, was throwing a party to celebrate his relationship with another woman. At their home, the house they'd designed together, dreamed in together, the place where they'd tried for 5 agonizing years to start the family that was finally, miraculously, happening. The invitation slipped from her trembling fingers, floating to the marble floor like a death warrant. David had left 3 weeks ago, claiming he needed space to think. He'd filed for divorce 2 days later, served through his lawyer while Sarah was at her prenatal appointment. But this was calculated humiliation on a scale she'd never imagined possible. Her phone buzzed. A text from her sister Jenny. "Did you see Madison's Instagram story, I'm coming over?" With shaking hands, Sarah opened the app she'd avoided for weeks. Madison Wells, 26 years old, perfect body, perfect skin, perfect life. The story showed her at a florist, selecting white roses and baby's breath. The caption read, "Planning something special with my love. New chapter starting soon." The comments were devastating. Friends Sarah had known for years were liking the posts, congratulating Madison, as if Sarah had simply ceased to exist, as if 8 years of marriage, 5 miscarriages, and this miracle pregnancy meant nothing. Sarah ran to the bathroom and vomited until there was nothing left. 20 minutes later, Jenny burst through the front door without knocking, her face a mask of righteous fury. That narcissistic piece of garbage, that calculating little witch. She found Sarah curled on the bathroom floor, still clutching her phone. "I can't do this, Jen," Sarah whispered. "I can't fight them both. Look at her. Look at me." She gestured at her swollen body, her tear-stained face, her unwashed hair. Jenny knelt beside her sister, her voice fierce with determination. "You listened to me. Sarah Martinez. You are carrying his child. You built that company with him from nothing. You stood by him through 3 failed startups and a nervous breakdown. You are not disappearing because some Instagram influencer decided she wanted your life. But the party, Jen, He's throwing a party to celebrate replacing me. Then we crash it, Jenny said simply. We show up, hold your head high, and remind everyone exactly what kind of man celebrates his pregnant wife's replacement. Sarah stared at her sister. Are you insane? I can't show up there. I can barely leave the house without crying. You're going, Jenny said, pulling Sarah to her feet. Because if you don't, you'll regret it for the rest of your life. And more importantly, someday your son is going to ask you what you did when his father tried to erase you from existence. You need to have a good answer. The words hit like a physical blow. Sarah's hand moved instinctively to her belly, where her son kicked as if responding to the tension. Her miracle baby, the child she'd prayed for through years of heartbreak and medical procedures. She thought about David's text from that morning. My lawyer will contact you about custody arrangements, as if their son was just another asset to be divided. What do I even wear to my own public execution? Sarah asked. Jenny smiled grimly. Something that reminds everyone exactly what he's losing. The week leading up to the party passed in a haze of preparation and disbelief. Sarah discovered the true cruelty of social media as photos of party preparations appeared daily on Madison's Instagram. The woman was documenting her triumph in real time, using hashtags like New Beginnings and True Love, while Sarah watched from the wreckage of her old life. The comments were worse than the posts. Mutual friends who'd attended Sarah and David's wedding were now congratulating Madison, calling her lucky and glowing. Some even shared memories of how perfect David and Madison looked together, as if Sarah had never existed. Jenny had moved in temporarily, claiming she needed to supervise the operation. In reality, Sarah knew her sister was terrified she'd have a breakdown and hurt herself or the baby. The fear wasn't entirely unfounded. There were moments, particularly at 3 a.m. when insomnia struck, that Sarah wondered if everyone would be better off without her. But then the baby would kick, and she'd remember she wasn't alone in this fight. We need to talk strategy, Jenny announced on Thursday morning, spreading newspapers across the kitchen table like a war room. This isn't just about showing up. It's about making a statement. Sarah pushed eggs around her plate, her appetite non-existent. What kind of statement? That I'm pathetic enough to attend my own humiliation? That you're strong enough to face it head on, Jenny corrected. Think about it, Sarah. David is counting on you hiding. He wants you to disappear quietly, so his narrative stays clean. Rich, successful man falls in love with beautiful young woman. Tale as old as time. Maybe that's what happened, Sarah said quietly. Maybe he never really loved me. Jenny slammed her coffee mug down hard enough to make Sarah jump. Stop it, right now. I watched that man cry when you lost the first baby. I saw him hold your hand through every doctor's appointment, every injection, every failed procedure. He loved you. Sarah. He's just a coward who couldn't handle the pressure of real life. Then why Madison? Why her? Because she's easy, Jenny said bluntly. No history, no baggage, no expectations. She's a fantasy, not a person. And fantasies don't last, but the damage they cause is very real. That afternoon, they went dress shopping. Sarah hadn't been clothes shopping since her second trimester, when she'd finally accepted that her pre-pregnancy wardrobe was temporarily retired. Now, faced with racks of maternity evening wear, she felt overwhelmed and ridiculous. I look like a tent, she said, emerging from the dressing room in a black dress that did nothing for her confidence. You look pregnant, Jenny corrected. There's a difference. Try the navy one. The navy dress was different. It was elegant without being flashy, sophisticated without trying too hard. It emphasized her curves rather than hiding them, made her pregnancy look like the miracle it was rather than an inconvenience. That's the one, Jenny said softly. "You look beautiful, Sarah. You look like yourself." For the first time in weeks, Sarah saw herself in the mirror rather than David's discarded wife. She was still beautiful, still valuable, still worthy of love and respect. The realization made her cry, but for once, they weren't tears of despair. Friday night, Sarah lay awake staring at the ceiling, the navy dress hanging in her closet like armor for tomorrow's battle. The baby was active, as if sensing her stress, his movements a constant reminder of what she was fighting for. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Don't come tomorrow. Trust me, it's not what you think." Sarah stared at the message, her heart racing. Who would warn her, and warn her about what she showed Jenny, who was immediately suspicious? "It's probably Madison playing games," Jenny said. "Or one of David's friends trying to keep you away. Delete it." But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that someone was trying to protect her from something worse than what she already knew was coming. The question was, could it possibly get worse than watching your husband celebrate your replacement while you carried his child? She would find out tomorrow night. As she finally drifted off to sleep, Sarah made a promise to herself and her unborn son, whatever happened at that party. She would survive it. She would be strong enough to protect them both, no matter what David and Madison had planned. She had no idea that by tomorrow night, her promise would be tested in ways she couldn't imagine, and that the anonymous text would prove to be the only honest communication she'd receive all week. The storm was coming, and Sarah was about to walk directly into its eye. Saturday evening arrived with all the inevitability of a funeral. Sarah stood before her bathroom mirror, applying makeup with hands that trembled despite her best efforts to stay calm. The navy dress fit perfectly, transforming her pregnancy into something elegant rather than awkward. Jenny had arranged for a professional to do her hair, sweeping it into a sophisticated updo that made her look older, more composed. "You look like a queen," Jenny said, adjusting Sarah's earrings. "Remember that when you walk in there, you belong in that house more than any of them." The Uber ride to the Carter estate took 23 minutes through the winding roads of Beverly Hills. Sarah watched familiar landmarks pass by, each one a reminder of the life she'd built and lost. The coffee shop where she and David used to have Sunday breakfast, the park where they jogged together before her pregnancy, the restaurant where he'd proposed 8 years ago, young and ambitious and so sure they could conquer the world together. "Are you sure about this?" the driver asked, glancing at her in the rearview mirror as they turned onto her old street. "You look like you're going to your own execution," Sarah almost laughed. "Something like that." The estate was ablaze with lights, the circular driveway lined with luxury cars that gleamed under strategically placed spotlights. Valets in crisp white jackets directed traffic with practiced efficiency. Through the windows, Sarah could see the party in full swing, at least 200 guests mingling in what used to be her living room. "I'll wait right here," the driver said unexpectedly. "Something doesn't feel right about this." Sarah paid him and stepped out into the warm October evening. The night air carried the scent of jasmine and expensive perfume, the sounds of laughter and clinking glasses. It should have been romantic. Instead, it felt like walking into a wake for her own life. The front door was open, guests flowing in and out freely. Sarah recognized most of them: business associates, social friends, people who'd been to dozens of dinner parties in this very house when she'd been the hostess. Now they looked right through her as if she were invisible. She made it 3 steps inside before the whispers started. "Oh my God, is that Sarah? What is she doing here? This is so awkward. Poor thing. She looks desperate." Sarah kept walking, her chin high, Jenny's words echoing in her head. "You belong here more than any of them. She moved through the crowd like a ghost, haunting her former life, noting the changes Madison had made to their home. The furniture was different, more modern and cold. The family photos had been replaced with abstract art. Even the smell was wrong. Madison's signature perfume instead of the vanilla candles Sarah had burned for years. She accepted a glass of sparkling water from a server who clearly recognized her but said nothing. The first sip nearly came back up as her nervous stomach rebelled, but she forced herself to keep moving, to keep breathing, to keep existing in this space that had been designed to erase her. Then she saw him. David stood near the grand staircase, wearing the Tom Ford tuxedo she'd bought him for their 5th anniversary. He looked exactly the same. Tall, handsome, confident, except for his eyes. When they met hers across the room, she saw something she'd never seen before. Genuine fear. He said something to the man beside him and started moving in her direction, weaving through guests who parted for him like he was royalty, which, in this crowd, he essentially was Sarah. His voice was carefully neutral when he reached her, but she could see the tension in his jaw. "I wasn't sure you'd come. You invited me," she replied, her voice steadier than she'd expected. "Though I noticed the invitation was addressed to my maiden name." Subtle. A flush crept up his neck. "We need to talk. Privately." "I don't think your girlfriend would appreciate that." As if summoned by the mention of her name, Madison Wells appeared at David's side like a perfectly orchestrated entrance. She was even more beautiful in person than in photos, tall, blonde, with the kind of effortless grace that came from a lifetime of privilege and professional photography. Her dress was white, because of course it was, a flowing creation that made her look like a modern goddess. "Sarah," Madison said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "I'm so glad you decided to come. This must be incredibly difficult for you." The words were designed to sound compassionate, but Sarah heard the calculation behind them. This was performance art, a public display of Madison's magnanimity in front of an audience that was watching every micro-expression. "Actually, I wouldn't miss it," Sarah replied with a smile that felt like glass. "It's fascinating to see what rises from the ashes of a marriage." Madison's perfect smile flickered for just a moment, but David stepped forward before either woman could escalate further. "Let's take this somewhere private," he said firmly, his hand hovering near Sarah's elbow without quite touching. "Oh no," Sarah said, stepping away from him. "I think we're well past private conversations, don't you? After all, you've made everything else public." The crowd around them was pretending not to listen while hanging on every word. Sarah could feel phones being discreetly positioned to record whatever happened next. In a few hours, this would be all over social media, dissected and analyzed by strangers. "Sarah, please," David said, and for a moment she heard an echo of the man she'd fallen in love with 12 years ago. "Don't do this." "Don't do what?" she asked. "Don't exist. Don't have feelings. Don't carry your child while you celebrate my replacement." The words carried further than she'd intended, causing a ripple of shocked silence to spread through nearby guests. Madison's face went pale beneath her perfect makeup, and David looked like he wanted to disappear through the floor. That's when Sarah realized the anonymous text had been right. This wasn't what she thought it was, but it was something much, much worse. The confrontation by the staircase had drawn attention, but it was nothing compared to what happened next. A server appeared with a microphone and handed it to David, who suddenly looked like a man being led to his own execution. The crowd began to gather, sensing that the real entertainment was about to begin. "Ladies and gentlemen," David said, his voice carrying through the sound system with professional clarity. Thank you all for joining us tonight to celebrate a new chapter in my life. Sarah felt the words like physical blows. She was standing 15 feet away, 7 months pregnant with his child, and he was talking about new chapters as if she'd never existed. I've learned a lot about myself over the past few months, David continued, his eyes finding Madison in the crowd. About what really matters, about what love actually means. The crowd murmured approvingly. Sarah wondered if any of them remembered toasting her and David's marriage in this very room just 18 months ago. Madison has shown me what it means to be truly alive, David said, his voice growing stronger as he warmed to his theme. She's brought joy back into my life when I thought happiness was impossible. Sarah's vision started to blur around the edges. This wasn't just a celebration announcement. This was a deliberate assassination of their shared history, a public declaration that everything they'd built together had been a lie. I'm not a man who makes decisions lightly, David continued, reaching for Madison's hand as she joined him in the spotlight. But when you find your soulmate, you don't hesitate to build a life with them. Soulmate. The word that Sarah had treasured when he'd used it in his wedding vows 8 years ago was being recycled for a new audience, stripped of all meaning and authenticity. So tonight, I'm thrilled to announce that Madison and I are moving forward together as partners in every sense of the word. The crowd erupted in applause. Sarah watched in horror as people she'd considered friends cheered for her replacement, celebrating the destruction of her marriage as if it were a romantic comedy rather than a human tragedy. Then Madison took the microphone, and Sarah realized the evening was about to get infinitely worse. Thank you all so much, Madison said, her voice perfectly calibrated for maximum impact. David is the most incredible man I've ever known, and I feel so blessed to be building a future with him. She paused, her eyes scanning the crowd until they found Sarah. The smile that followed was pure calculation dressed up as compassion. I also want to acknowledge that new beginnings sometimes come with complicated circumstances. Madison continued, her voice taking on a tone of gentle understanding. I know tonight must be difficult for some people, and I want everyone to know that David and I approach this transition with nothing but respect and hope for healing. The crowd murmured its approval of her grace and maturity. Sarah felt like she was watching a master class in public manipulation, every word designed to paint Madison as the compassionate party while positioning Sarah as the bitter, unstable ex-wife. David has told me so much about the journey that brought him to this point, Madison continued. And I have nothing but admiration for the strength it took for him to prioritize his authentic happiness. Authentic happiness. As if 8 years of marriage had been an elaborate lie he'd finally escaped. I also want to acknowledge that David will always be connected to his past through his upcoming role as a father, Madison said, her hand moving to rest on her flat stomach in a gesture that made Sarah's blood run cold. And I'm excited to support him in that journey, whatever form it takes. The implication was clear. Madison would be graciously allowing David to have some contact with his child, as if Sarah's pregnancy was an inconvenience to be managed rather than a human being to be cherished. Sarah felt the first sharp pain in her abdomen, a cramping sensation that made her gasp. The stress was affecting the baby, and she needed to get out of this toxic environment before something terrible happened. But Madison wasn't finished. Finally, I want to say directly to Sarah, who I know is here tonight, Madison said, her eyes finding Sarah in the crowd with laser precision. I hope you can find peace with this situation. David speaks of you with such fondness, and I know he wants nothing but happiness for you and your child. The crowd turned to look at Sarah. Hundreds of eyes trained on her like she was an exhibit in a zoo. She felt exposed, humiliated, reduced to a footnote in the story of David and Madison's great love. "I hope we can all move forward with grace and maturity," Madison concluded, "because at the end of the day, we're all just trying to build the best lives we can." The applause was thunderous. Sarah watched in shock as people who'd known her for years clapped enthusiastically for Madison's performance, bought completely into the narrative that painted Sarah as an obstacle to be overcome rather than a human being whose life had been destroyed. That's when the second wave of cramping hit. Stronger this time, accompanied by a sharp, stabbing pain that made her double over. Something was wrong. Very wrong. Sarah. Jenny appeared at her side from nowhere, her face white with concern. "What's happening?" "The baby," Sarah whispered, her hand pressing against her abdomen as another contraction seized her. "Something's wrong with the baby." The crowd was still applauding Madison's speech, oblivious to the medical emergency unfolding 15 feet away. Sarah tried to stay upright, tried to maintain her dignity, but her body was betraying her just as thoroughly as her husband had. "We need to get you out of here," Jenny said urgently, but it was too late. Sarah felt something warm and wet between her legs, and when she looked down, she saw blood seeping through her navy dress. The last thing she remembered before hitting the marble floor was the sound of Madison's laughter mixing with the horrified screams of the crowd. The world exploded into chaos the moment Sarah hit the marble floor. The elegant party atmosphere shattered like glass as guests screamed and surged backward, creating a circle of horrified spectators around her crumpled form. Blood pooled beneath her navy dress, stark against the white marble David had insisted on during their renovation. "Call 911. Jenny's voice cut through the panic as she dropped to her knees beside her sister. "Someone call 911 right now." Sarah was conscious but fading, her vision tunneling as pain ripped through her abdomen in waves that threatened to tear her apart from the inside. She could hear voices around her, but they seemed to come from underwater, distorted and distant. "Oh my God, is she losing the baby? This is so awful. Should we clear the room? Is someone filming this?" Through the haze of pain and panic, Sarah saw David pushing through the crowd, his face white with shock. When he reached her, he dropped to his knees without regard for his expensive tuxedo, his hands hovering over her as if he wanted to help but didn't know how. "Sarah, oh God, Sarah," he whispered, his voice breaking. "What have I done?" Madison appeared behind him, her white dress pristine and untouched by the crisis unfolding at her feet. Her expression was unreadable, not quite concerned, not quite indifferent, but something calculating and cold that made Sarah's stomach turn even harder. "The ambulance is on the way," someone shouted from across the room. Sarah tried to speak, to tell them about the cramping that had been building all evening, but no words came. Instead, another wave of pain crashed over her, so intense that she arched off the floor despite Jenny's attempts to keep her still. "Ma'am, I'm a doctor," a voice said authoritatively. Dr. Rebecca Chen, whom Sarah recognized from previous parties, knelt beside Jenny and began examining Sarah with professional efficiency. "How far along are you?" 7 months, Jenny answered when Sarah couldn't. "She's been under enormous stress." Dr. Chen's face was grim as she checked Sarah's pulse and lifted her dress to assess the bleeding. "This looks like placental abruption. We need to get her to a hospital immediately." "What does that mean?" David asked, his voice raw with fear. "It means the placenta is separating from the uterine wall," Dr. Chen explained tersely. "It can be life-threatening for both mother and baby." Sarah heard the words but couldn't process them. Life-threatening. both mother and baby. The miracle child she'd waited 5 years for, carried for 7 months, loved with every fiber of her being, was in danger because she'd been stupid enough to come to this party. The paramedics arrived like a SWAT team, pushing through the crowd with professional urgency. They transferred Sarah to a gurney with efficient precision, starting an IV line and checking her vital signs while asking rapid-fire questions that Jenny answered on her behalf. Any history of pregnancy complications? 5 previous miscarriages, but this pregnancy has been normal until tonight. Any drug or alcohol use? None. She's been incredibly careful. Recent trauma or stress? Jenny's eyes found David across the room. You could say that. As they wheeled her toward the ambulance, Sarah caught a glimpse of the party guests standing in shocked clusters, some still holding champagne glasses as if unsure whether the evening was over. Their faces showed a mixture of morbid fascination and uncomfortable guilt, like people who'd come to watch a public execution and gotten more than they'd bargained for. Madison stood apart from the crowd, her arms crossed over her chest, watching the proceedings with the detached interest of someone observing a mildly interesting television show. There was no concern in her expression, no horror at what her actions had helped precipitate, just cold calculation, as if she were already planning how to spin this crisis to her advantage. David tried to follow the gurney, but the paramedics stopped him at the ambulance doors. "Family only," one of them said firmly. "I'm her husband," David protested. "Not anymore," Jenny said icily, climbing into the ambulance beside Sarah. "You made that very clear tonight." The doors slammed shut, cutting off David's protests and Madison's calculating stare. As the ambulance pulled away, Sarah could see the Carter estate in the rearview window, blazing with lights like a fortress she'd been exiled from. The party was over, but somehow she doubted that would stop the guests from talking about what they'd witnessed for months to come. "The baby," Sarah whispered, her first words since the collapse. "Is going to be fine," Jenny said firmly, gripping her hand. "You're both going to be fine." But Jenny's eyes were red with tears, and Sarah could see her own fear reflected in her sister's face. The pain was getting worse, not better, and the paramedic monitoring her vital signs looked increasingly concerned. "Fetal heart rate is dropping," he said quietly into his radio. "ETA to Cedars-Sinai is 8 minutes. Have NICU standing by." NICU. Neonatal Intensive Care Unit. For babies who were too small, too sick, too fragile to survive on their own. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to send every ounce of her strength to the tiny life inside her. The son she'd already named Ethan after David's grandfather. "Please, survive this," she prayed silently. "Please don't let my stupidity kill you." As the ambulance raced through the streets of Beverly Hills toward the hospital, Sarah made a promise to herself and her unborn child if they both survived this night. She would never again put them in danger for the sake of her pride or her pain. She had no way of knowing that this crisis would prove to be the least of her worries, and that the real betrayal was still waiting to unfold. Cedars-Sinai Medical Center at 11:30 p.m. was a symphony of controlled chaos. Sarah was rushed through sliding doors into a world of fluorescent lights and urgent voices, her gurney surrounded by medical professionals who spoke in rapid code about blood pressure and fetal distress. The smell of antiseptic replaced the jasmine from David's party, harsh reality washing away the evening's manufactured elegance. Sarah Martinez, 32 years old, 30 weeks pregnant, suspected placental abruption. The paramedic rattled off to the emergency room doctor as they transferred her to a hospital bed. BP is 160/95, fetal heart rate dropping intermittently. Dr. Amanda Rodriguez, the on-call obstetrician, appeared at Sarah's bedside with the calm authority of someone who'd handled countless pregnancy emergencies. "Sarah, I'm Dr. Rodriguez. We're going to take excellent care of you and your baby, but I need you to stay as calm as possible while we figure out what's happening." Sarah nodded, though calm felt impossible when her body was betraying her and her son's life hung in the balance. Jenny stood beside the bed, still wearing her party dress, holding Sarah's hand like a lifeline. The ultrasound machine was wheeled in, and Dr. Rodriguez applied gel to Sarah's exposed belly. The room fell silent as she moved the wand around, studying the black and white images on the screen with practiced intensity. "There," she said finally, pointing to a small, flickering light on the monitor. "That's your son's heartbeat. It's strong. Sarah, he's a fighter." Sarah burst into tears of relief, the first positive news she'd heard all evening. On the screen, she could see Ethan moving, his tiny hands clenched into fists, his profile perfect and determined. "However," Dr. Rodriguez continued, her tone becoming more serious, "you are experiencing a partial placental abruption, likely triggered by extreme stress. The bleeding has stabilized for now, but we need to monitor you very closely. Any further separation could require an emergency C-section." "How early is too early?" Jenny asked the question Sarah was too afraid to voice. "At 30 weeks. Babies have an excellent chance of survival with proper NICU care," Dr. Rodriguez said. "But obviously, we want him to stay put as long as possible. Sarah, I need you to understand that the next 24 to 48 hours are critical. Complete bed rest, minimal stress, and we monitor both of you constantly. Minimal stress." Sarah almost laughed at the impossibility of that instruction. Her husband had just publicly celebrated her replacement while she carried his child. Her entire life had imploded in front of 200 witnesses. Minimal stress seemed about as achievable as sprouting wings. "Can I stay with her?" Jenny asked. "Of course. Family support is crucial right now." They moved Sarah to a private room in the maternity ward, a space that felt both sterile and oddly comforting. The bed was positioned so she could see out the window to the city lights of Los Angeles, a reminder that life continued beyond this medical crisis. Jenny settled into the uncomfortable chair beside the bed, still wearing her heels from the party. "I should call Mom and Dad," she said. "They're going to want to fly out." "Not yet," Sarah said quickly. "Let's see what happens in the next day or two. No point in panicking everyone if this stabilizes." What she didn't say was that she couldn't bear the thought of her parents seeing her this broken, this humiliated. They'd warned her about David's ego, his need to always be the center of attention. They'd been polite about it, supportive of her choice. But she'd seen the concern in their eyes during the wedding planning. "You should try to sleep," Jenny said. But sleep felt impossible with monitors beeping and nurses checking on them every hour. At 2 a.m., there was a soft knock on the door. David appeared in the doorway, no longer wearing his tuxedo, but dressed in jeans and a wrinkled button-down shirt. He looked like he'd aged 10 years since the party. "How is she?" he asked Jenny, as if Sarah weren't right there and conscious. "How do you think she is?" Jenny snapped. "You nearly killed her tonight." "I didn't mean for this to happen," David said, stepping into the room despite Jenny's obvious hostility. "Sarah, I'm so sorry. I never wanted you to get hurt." Sarah looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time in months. The man she'd fallen in love with at 24, built a company with, dreamed of children with for years. He looked genuinely devastated, but she could no longer tell if his emotions were real or just another performance. "You invited me to that party," she said quietly. You sent me an invitation to watch you celebrate my replacement. What exactly did you think would happen? I thought you wouldn't come, he admitted, running his hands through his hair. The invitation was Madison's idea. She said it would show that we were handling the separation with maturity and grace. Of course, it had been Madison's idea. Sarah filed that information away for future consideration. And you agreed to it, she said. You thought it was appropriate to invite your pregnant wife to your girlfriend's celebration party. Ex-wife, David corrected automatically, then immediately looked like he regretted the words. The divorce papers. Sarah had been so focused on the medical crisis that she'd forgotten the legal reality of her situation. She was no longer David's wife in any meaningful sense. She was just the mother of his child, a biological connection he was legally obligated to acknowledge. I want you to leave, she said, her voice steady despite the pain in her chest. I can't handle your presence right now, and stress is dangerous for the baby. Sarah, please, let me stay. Let me help. You've helped enough, Jenny said, standing up to physically block David's approach to the bed. She needs rest, and you need to go figure out how you're going to explain to your son someday why you tried to erase his mother from existence. David looked like he wanted to argue, but the monitors attached to Sarah started beeping more rapidly, indicating her rising stress levels. A nurse appeared as if summoned by the sound. Is everything all right in here? She asked, her eyes taking in the scene quickly. This gentleman was just leaving, Jenny said firmly. David opened his mouth to protest, then seemed to think better of it. I'll be back tomorrow, he said. To check on both of you. After he left, Sarah felt her body relax slightly, the monitor beeps returning to their normal rhythm. But sleep still eluded her as she stared at the ceiling and wondered how her life had become a medical emergency wrapped in a public humiliation. She had no idea that David's visit was just the beginning, and that tomorrow would bring revelations that would make tonight's crisis seem simple by comparison. Sarah spent 3 days in the hospital, 3 days of round-the-clock monitoring that felt like house arrest in a medical facility. The bleeding had stopped. Ethan's heartbeat remained strong, and Dr. Rodriguez was cautiously optimistic about keeping the pregnancy going to term, but the psychological wounds from the party were harder to treat than the physical ones. Jenny had appointed herself as Sarah's guardian, screening visitors and phone calls with military efficiency. The story of Sarah's collapse had already made its way through their social circle, spawning dozens of text messages that ranged from genuinely concerned to morbidly curious. Jenny handled them all, allowing only Sarah's parents and closest friends to have any contact. Marcus called again, Jenny reported on Tuesday morning, referring to David's business partner. He seems genuinely worried about you. Sarah found that surprising. Marcus Chen had been David's best man at their wedding, but she'd assumed his loyalty would remain with his business partner and lifelong friend. What did he say? That he's been trying to talk sense into David, but David's not listening to anyone right now. Apparently, Madison has some kind of hold over him that nobody understands. The mention of Madison's name made Sarah's stomach clench. She'd been trying not to think about the woman who'd orchestrated her public humiliation, but avoiding the subject felt like pretending a tumor didn't exist just because you couldn't see it. Has David been back? Every day, Jenny said. I keep telling him you're sleeping or with doctors. He brings flowers that I throw away and asks questions about Ethan that I don't answer. Sarah appreciated her sister's protection, but she couldn't hide in this hospital room forever. Eventually, she'd have to face the reality of co-parenting with David, of sharing custody with a man who'd chosen to celebrate her replacement while she carried his child. There's something else, Jenny said, her tone becoming more serious. I hired someone to look into Madison Wells. You did what? A private investigator. Don't look at me like that. Sarah, something about this whole situation doesn't add up. David might be selfish and weak, but he's not usually cruel. The party, the invitation, the public humiliation, that level of calculated cruelty feels like someone else's playbook. Sarah wanted to dismiss her sister's conspiracy theories, but the anonymous text from Friday night still bothered her. Someone had tried to warn her away from the party, had known it would be worse than she expected. What did you find out? Madison Wells isn't exactly who she claims to be, Jenny said, pulling out her phone to show Sarah a series of screenshots. Her Instagram shows this perfect California lifestyle, but according to public records, she only moved to Los Angeles 8 months ago. Before that, she was living in Miami under a different name. The photos on Jenny's phone showed a driver's license and apartment rental agreement for someone named Madison Walsh, not Wells. The woman in the ID photo was unmistakably the same person, but the discrepancy was troubling. People change their names, Sarah said, though her heart was beginning to race. Maybe she wanted a fresh start. Maybe, Jenny agreed. But then there's this. The next photo showed a group shot from what appeared to be a high-end networking event in Miami. Madison was standing next to a man Sarah didn't recognize, both of them wearing the kind of expensive clothing that suggested serious money. The man she's with is called Robert Blackstone, Jenny explained. He's been indicted 3 times for corporate espionage and securities fraud, never convicted, but he's made a career out of getting close to powerful men and destroying them from the inside. Sarah stared at the photo, trying to process what her sister was suggesting. You think Madison is working for this man, that she targeted David deliberately? I think Madison Wells is very good at becoming exactly what rich, powerful men think they want, Jenny said. And I think David is too arrogant to realize he's being played. The possibility sent a chill through Sarah that had nothing to do with the hospital's aggressive air conditioning. If Madison was some kind of professional manipulator, then David wasn't just cheating. He was being systematically destroyed by someone who'd studied his weaknesses and exploited them with surgical precision. There's more, Jenny continued. The investigator found evidence that Madison has been in contact with several of David's business competitors. Phone calls, meetings, email exchanges that David doesn't know about. What kind of contact? The kind that could destroy Carter Industries if David's business secrets ended up in the wrong hands. Sarah closed her eyes, trying to absorb the implications. David's company was his life's work, the empire he'd built from nothing over 15 years. If Madison was stealing his trade secrets and passing them to competitors, she wasn't just breaking up his marriage. She was destroying everything he'd worked for. We have to tell him, Sarah said. Do we? Jenny asked. He chose her over you. Sarah, he invited you to watch him celebrate your replacement. Why should you save him from his own stupidity? It was a fair question, and part of Sarah, the part that had been humiliated and discarded, wanted to let David burn. But another part of her, the part that had loved him for 8 years and was carrying his child, couldn't watch him walk into a trap without at least trying to warn him. Because Ethan deserves to have a father who isn't completely destroyed, she said finally. And because no matter what David's done to me, he doesn't deserve to have his life's work stolen by a professional con artist. Jenny sighed, but Sarah could see she'd expected this response. Her sister had always been the vengeful one, while Sarah tended toward forgiveness, even when it wasn't deserved. So what do you want to do? Before Sarah could answer, there was a knock on the door. David appeared in the doorway, looking haggard and uncertain. How are you feeling? He asked, his eyes taking in the monitors and medical equipment that surrounded her bed. Better, Sarah said. The baby's okay. That's what matters. Can I sit down? There's something I need to tell you. Jenny looked like she wanted to object, but Sarah nodded toward the chair beside her bed. Whatever was happening with Madison, David deserved to know the truth. But first, she wanted to hear what he had to say. I've been thinking about what happened at the party, David began, his voice heavy with guilt. About how everything spiraled out of control so quickly. And I keep coming back to the same question. How did we get here? Sarah could have given him a detailed timeline of his betrayal, but she sensed he was working towards something important. I think I know, she said quietly. But I'm not sure you're going to like the answer. David's face went pale at Sarah's words, but before he could respond, Jenny stood up from her chair with military precision. I'm going to get coffee, she announced, grabbing her purse with deliberate force. This conversation is between you two. After Jenny left, David moved his chair closer to Sarah's bed, his expression more serious than she'd seen it since before their separation. What do you mean? You know how we got here? He asked. Sarah studied his face, looking for signs of the man she'd fallen in love with beneath the layers of guilt and confusion that seemed to have settled over him like a fog. David, what do you actually know about Madison? She asked carefully. What kind of question is that I know everything about her? We've been together for 6 months. Do you know her real name? David's expression shifted from confusion to wariness. Her real name is Madison Wells. What are you getting at? Sarah. Her real name is Madison Walsh, Sarah said gently. She changed it when she moved to Los Angeles 8 months ago, right around the time she would have started planning how to meet you. That's ridiculous, David said, but his voice lacked conviction. People change their names for all kinds of reasons. Did you know she was living in Miami before she came here, working with a man named Robert Blackstone? The color drained from David's face completely. He knew that name. Sarah realized. It meant something to him. How do you know about Blackstone? He whispered. Jenny hired a private investigator. David, Robert Blackstone is your competitor. He's been trying to get inside information about Carter Industries for years. David sat back in his chair as if he'd been physically struck. No, he said, shaking his head. No, that's not possible. Madison loves me. She moved across the country to be with me. She moved across the country to get close to you, Sarah corrected. Think about it. David. How did you meet her? At the industry conference in March. She was there covering the event for a lifestyle blog. A lifestyle blog that doesn't exist anymore, Sarah said. Jenny checked. The website was taken down 3 weeks after you met. David stood up abruptly, pacing to the window and back. Sarah could see him working through the timeline in his head, connecting dots he'd been too infatuated to notice. She asked me so many questions about the business, he said slowly. I thought she was just interested in my work, impressed by what I'd built. What kind of questions? About our client list, our proprietary software, our expansion plans. His voice was getting quieter with each admission. She said she wanted to understand what made me successful. Sarah felt a mixture of vindication and pity as she watched her husband realize he'd been expertly manipulated by a professional. Madison hadn't fallen in love with David's charm or success. She'd studied him like a lab rat and pushed every button that would make him feel important and desired. There's more, Sarah said gently. The investigator found evidence that Madison has been meeting with your competitors, sharing information she's gotten from you. David stopped pacing and turned to face her, his expression a mixture of devastation and growing anger. How much information? Enough to explain why you've been losing clients to Blackstone Industries over the past 3 months. The words hit him like a physical blow. Carter Industries had indeed been hemorrhaging clients recently, losing major contracts to competitors who seemed to know exactly how to undercut their bids and exploit their weaknesses. "She's been in my office," David said, his voice hollow. "She has access to my computer, my files, everything." "I'm sorry," Sarah said, and she meant it. Watching David realize the extent of his betrayal was painful, even after everything he'd put her through. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked suddenly. "After what I did to you, why would you warn me?" Sarah touched her belly, where Ethan was performing his regular afternoon gymnastics routine. "Because you're his father," she said simply, "and because no one deserves to have their life's work stolen, not even you." David sat back down heavily, his head in his hands. "I've lost everything," he said. "My marriage, my company, my self-respect, and for what? For a woman who was playing me from day one." "You haven't lost everything," Sarah said firmly. "You still have your son, and you still have a chance to save your company if you act quickly. How? You confront Madison, you find out exactly what she's passed along and to whom, you document everything and turn it over to the FBI if necessary. Corporate espionage is a federal crime. David looked up at her with something like wonder in his eyes. "After everything I've done to you, you're still trying to save me." "I'm trying to save our son's future," Sarah corrected. "If Madison destroys Carter Industries, Ethan loses his inheritance and his father's legacy. I won't let that happen." Before David could respond, the door burst open and Jenny rushed in, her face white with panic. "We have a problem," she said breathlessly. "Madison's outside. She's demanding to see David, and she's not taking no for an answer." Through the window, Sarah could see a crowd gathering in the hallway. Madison's voice carried through the door, raised in what sounded like righteous indignation. "She knows," David said quietly. "Somehow, she knows we're onto her." Sarah felt her heart rate spike, and the monitors around her bed began beeping more rapidly. Whatever confrontation was about to happen, it needed to happen away from her hospital room. The stress could trigger another placental abruption, putting Ethan's life at risk. "David, you need to get her away from here," Sarah said urgently. "Take her home. Confront her there. I can't handle another crisis right now." David nodded, understanding immediately. He stood up, his expression hardening with resolve. "This ends today," he said. "Whatever the cost, this ends today." As he walked toward the door to face Madison, Sarah realized that the real battle was just beginning, and this time, she wouldn't be on the sidelines watching her life explode. This time, she would be fighting for her son's future, even if it meant saving the man who'd broken her heart. Madison Wells stood in the hospital hallway like a force of nature barely contained by civilized society. Her usual perfect composure had cracked, revealing something sharp and dangerous underneath. When David emerged from Sarah's room, her green eyes locked onto him with predatory intensity. "We need to talk," she said, her voice pitched low but carrying clearly through the corridor. "Now." "Yes, we do," David replied, his own voice steady in a way that surprised Sarah as she watched through the partially open door. "But not here. This is a hospital. Madison, there are sick people trying to rest." "Oh, how considerate of you," Madison said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "Suddenly, you care about other people's comfort. That's new." Jenny had positioned herself in the doorway, blocking Madison's view into the room while keeping an eye on the confrontation. Sarah could see her sister's tension in the rigid line of her shoulders. "Let's go home," David said firmly. We can discuss whatever's bothering you there. What's bothering me, Madison said, stepping closer to him, is that your ex-wife has been spreading lies about me, hiring investigators, making accusations, trying to destroy my reputation. So she did know about the investigation. Sarah wondered how Madison had found out so quickly and what that said about the scope of her surveillance operation. Are they lies? David asked quietly. The question hung in the air like a challenge. Madison's perfect mask slipped for just a moment, revealing a flash of something cold and calculating before she reassembled her expression into wounded innocence. How can you even ask me that? She said, reaching for his arm. After everything we've shared, everything we've built together, you're going to believe the desperate accusations of a woman who can't accept that you've moved on. David stepped away from her touch, a gesture that didn't go unnoticed. I asked you a simple question. Madison, are Sarah's accusations lies? This is ridiculous, Madison said, her voice rising despite the hospital setting. I'm not going to dignify paranoid conspiracy theories with a response. Then let's go home, David said again, his tone leaving no room for argument. We'll settle this privately. Madison looked like she wanted to push past him into Sarah's room, but David blocked her path with his body. For a moment, the two of them faced off in a battle of wills that crackled with tension. Fine, Madison said finally. But this conversation better end with you coming to your senses and cutting contact with that manipulative woman permanently. They left together, Madison's heels clicking aggressively on the hospital floor as David guided her toward the elevators. Sarah exhaled slowly, only then realizing she'd been holding her breath through the entire confrontation. That woman is dangerous, Jenny said, closing the door firmly behind them. Did you see her face when David questioned her for about 2 seconds there? The mask came completely off. Sarah had seen it too. A glimpse of the predator Madison really was beneath her carefully constructed persona. It made her even more worried about what might happen when David confronted her with the evidence of her betrayal. Should we call someone? Sarah asked. What if she does something to David? David's a big boy, Jenny said, though her tone suggested she was concerned too. Besides, he needs to face this himself. He got himself into this mess by ignoring every red flag in the book. They waited in tense silence for over an hour before Sarah's phone rang. David's name appeared on the screen, and she answered immediately. Are you okay? She asked without preamble. I'm fine, David said, but his voice sounded hollow and exhausted. You were right, Sarah, about all of it. What happened? I confronted her with everything. The name change, Blackstone, the meetings with competitors. At first she tried to deny it. Then she tried to turn it around and blame me for not trusting her. And then she realized the game was over, David said with bitter laughter. The mask came off completely. You should have seen her. Sarah. It was like watching someone shed their skin. The woman I thought I loved never existed. Sarah felt a complex mixture of vindication and sadness. She'd been right about Madison, but taking satisfaction in David's pain felt hollow when their son would ultimately suffer the consequences. What did she say? That I was an easy mark from the beginning. That my ego made me vulnerable to exactly the kind of manipulation she specialized in. She said I was so desperate to feel young and desired again that I ignored obvious signs she was using me. The words must have been devastating to hear, especially because they contained more truth than David probably wanted to acknowledge. I'm sorry, Sarah said, and meant it. She's been copying files from my computer for months, David continued. Client lists, financial projections, proprietary software code. She's passed everything to Blackstone Industries. My own company has been competing against its own stolen information. What are you going to do? I've already called my lawyer and the FBI, David said. They're opening a corporate espionage investigation. Madison's probably in custody by the time we finish this conversation. Sarah closed her eyes, trying to process the magnitude of what had unfolded. In less than 24 hours, her husband's affair had revealed itself to be an elaborate corporate conspiracy that had nearly destroyed both his marriage and his business. "Where are you now?" she asked. "Sitting in my car outside the police station." David said, "I needed to call you before I go in to give my statement. Sarah, I know I don't deserve your forgiveness after what I put you through, but I need you to know that what happened between us wasn't about you. It was about my own weakness, my own stupidity." "I know," Sarah said quietly. It didn't erase the pain of his betrayal or the humiliation of that party, but understanding Madison's manipulation did provide some context for how quickly David had abandoned their marriage. "I want to be a good father to Ethan," David continued. "I know I don't deserve the chance, but if you'll let me, I want to try to make up for the damage I've caused." Sarah looked out the hospital window at the city lights beginning to twinkle in the early evening darkness. Tomorrow, she would be discharged. Tomorrow, she would begin building a new life as a single mother. But tonight, for the first time in months, she felt like the worst was finally behind them. "We'll figure it out," she said, "one day at a time." 6 months later, Sarah stood in the nursery of her new apartment, watching Ethan sleep in his crib. Born healthy at 37 weeks after spending the remainder of her pregnancy on modified bed rest, he was now a thriving 4-month-old with David's dark hair and what Sarah hoped was her own stubborn determination. The apartment was smaller than the Beverly Hills mansion she'd shared with David, but it was hers. Every piece of furniture, every decoration, every decision had been made by her alone. It felt like freedom after years of compromise and consultation. Jenny appeared in the doorway, holding 2 cups of coffee and wearing the satisfied expression of someone whose suspicions had been thoroughly vindicated. "Madison Walsh made the news again," she announced, handing Sarah a mug and settling into the rocking chair beside the crib. "Good news or bad news?" Sarah asked, though she was no longer sure she cared either way. Madison's arrest and the subsequent investigation had become tabloid fodder for weeks, but Sarah had tried to distance herself from the circus. "Sentenced to 5 years in federal prison for corporate espionage," Jenny said. Apparently, David's company wasn't her first target. The FBI found evidence linking her to similar schemes involving 3 other tech executives over the past 2 years. Sarah felt a mixture of satisfaction and pity. Madison was a predator who destroyed multiple lives in pursuit of money and power. But she was also a cautionary tale about what happened when someone chose manipulation over authentic connection. "How's David handling it?" Jenny asked. "Better than I expected," Sarah said honestly. The past 6 months had revealed a version of David she'd forgotten existed. Humbled, focused, genuinely committed to rebuilding his relationship with his son. Carter Industries survived the security breach, and he's been surprisingly present as a father. It was true. David visited Ethan 3 times a week, had attended every pediatric appointment, and had even taken a parenting class to learn proper infant care techniques. He was awkward and overeager, but his love for their son was genuine and undeniable. "And how are you handling it?" Jenny asked, her tone gentler. Sarah considered the question as she watched Ethan's chest rise and fall in the steady rhythm of infant sleep. The past 6 months had been the hardest of her life, recovering from a traumatic birth, navigating single motherhood, rebuilding her identity outside of her marriage. But they'd also been transformative in ways she couldn't have imagined. "I'm okay," she said, surprised to realize it was true. "Better than okay. Actually, For the first time in years, I feel like myself. The divorce had been finalized 3 months ago, a surprisingly amicable process once Madison's manipulation came to light. David had insisted on generous financial support, partly out of guilt and partly because he genuinely wanted to ensure Ethan's security. Sarah had used part of the settlement to start her own marketing consultancy, working with small businesses while maintaining the flexibility to be present for her son. "Have you thought about dating?" Jenny asked carefully. Sarah laughed, gesturing to her postpartum body and the spit-up stain on her shirt. "I can barely manage to shower regularly. Romance is not exactly a priority right now." "I'm not talking about romance," Jenny said. "I'm talking about remembering that you're a woman, not just a mother." It was a fair point. Sarah had thrown herself so completely into motherhood and career rebuilding that she'd forgotten to consider her own emotional needs beyond survival and stability. "Maybe someday," Sarah said, "but right now, this is enough." She meant it. Standing in her own home, watching her healthy son sleep, knowing she'd survived the worst betrayal of her life and emerged stronger, it felt like more than enough. It felt like victory. The doorbell rang, interrupting her thoughts. David appeared in the hallway a few minutes later, carrying grocery bags and wearing the slightly overwhelmed expression of someone still learning to navigate unexpected parenthood. "I brought dinner," he announced, "and diapers, and that organic baby food you mentioned." "You don't have to bring groceries every time you visit," Sarah said, though she appreciated the gesture. "I want to," David replied simply. "It's the least I can do." They'd settled into an easy co-parenting rhythm that worked better than Sarah had expected. David was respectful of her space and decisions, grateful for every moment with Ethan, and carefully avoiding any reference to their shared romantic history. It wasn't friendship exactly, but it was functional and peaceful. As David lifted Ethan from his crib for their evening routine, Sarah felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with reconciliation or forgiveness. This was her family now, unconventional, complicated, but built on honesty rather than illusion. "Thank you," David said quietly as Ethan settled against his chest, "for giving me this chance." "Thank you," Sarah replied, "for becoming the father he deserves." Outside her apartment window, Los Angeles sparkled with possibility. Sarah's life looked nothing like what she'd planned at 24 when she'd married David with stars in her eyes and dreams of traditional happiness. But it was hers now, messy, imperfect, and absolutely authentic. That night, after David left and Jenny returned to her own apartment, Sarah sat in the rocking chair beside Ethan's crib and allowed herself to imagine the future. Not the fantasy version she'd once chased, but the real one she was building day by day. Someday, she might fall in love again. Someday, she might expand her business or move to a bigger apartment or take Ethan on adventures around the world. But tonight, watching her son sleep peacefully in the home she'd created through her own strength and determination, Sarah Martinez felt rich beyond measure. The golden invitation that had shattered her world 8 months ago was long gone, but the woman who'd survived its aftermath was just beginning to discover what she was truly capable of achieving. And that, Sarah realized as she turned off the nursery light and headed to her own bed, was the most valuable treasure of all. Sarah's journey from devastating betrayal to ultimate triumph proves that our greatest strength often emerges from our deepest pain. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you believe in the power of resilience, hit that like button and let me know in the comments which moment impacted you most. Share this with someone who needs to hear that they're stronger than they know. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories of real people overcoming impossible odds. Your support helps me bring you these powerful tales of human courage every week. Thank you for listening. And remember, you're more resilient than you realize.